Right, good afternoon everyone to this final panel of the day. Thank you all for being here for what is sure to be a very stimulating discussion about the world ahead. I think whether you are optimistic or pessimistic about the future, I'm sure we can all agree it's full of uncertainty. But I take some comfort, perhaps, in seeing that this panel has a number of Asians and a man who is very invested in and interested in Asia. So that gives you some indication of where the conversation might go. And that's only appropriate. We're sitting here in Los Angeles, and Shanghai lies just a tad further away geographically than London, to our west, which is why I find it rather odd that we refer to it as the Far East. Maybe we can dispense with that after this discussion. But we will start by talking about China, which used to be the elephant in the room, but no longer. Sure, you've all noticed that in Washington these days, the rhetoric has slipped very comfortably into language of a new Cold War that's united hawks and doves across the aisle on trade and security issues. It's become something of a common assumption now that China has hegemonic ambitions, that it will not give up on its military modernization and its neo-mercantile industrial policy until it dominates the world, to put it bluntly. So let's start with Mr. Tung from Hong Kong. You are truly a statesman, a very philosophical thinker about these issues. So I wanted to start by throwing out to you something of a tricky question. In our earlier conversation, you said that China's rise has indeed been astounding, and in fact, we may well have underestimated it, and that China needs to tell a better story about itself. So here's what I'm wondering. If China were to tell a better story about this extraordinary rise, wouldn't that just scare the world even more?
Thank you, my friend. I put it this way, that China needs to tell really a good story, has a good story to tell. And, for me, I would say, without any difficulty, China has no hegemonic intentions, none whatsoever. And you will ask me, why? And I will tell you that I grew up in a generation, sorry, I'm 81 years old, and I grew up in a generation at that time that China was not like today, strong and confident. They were beaten up all over the place. There was a very cruel war with the Japanese. There was the occupation by European powers, and we were kicked around, And therefore, we understand the pain of being occupied. We understand the cost, the pain of war. That's why, we have more DNA in our skin, in our body, for peace. And then the other is that every day, whether it's my grandmother who believes in Buddhists, or whether Confucius, which influenced my family through my father, we're always talking about peace, how important it is, And if you look carefully about all the wars that China has fought, it's more defensive than anything else. You were always talking about building walls, and we really built the walls, the Great Wall of China. Yeah, but the purpose was to prevent people from invading us, So the other point I want to make, I can make about 10 points, and I know you don't want me to make 10 points. Mm-hmm. I make 2 points, and I will finish. Second point I would say is this, that a good U.S.-China relation is good for China. It's also good for America. But one other thing we must remember, a good U.S.-China relation is good for the world at large. There are many, many complicated issues the world needs to face. And I cannot imagine these problems can be solved by either America or by China. But together, there is better chance. And to give an example, Mr. George Bush in 2008 telephoned Mr. Hu Jintao, inviting him to come to Washington for the crucial meeting, in which actually Mr. Hu Jintao pledged $400 billion. The purpose is that America was spending $800 billion for the domestic economy, and China agreed to put up $400 billion for the domestic economy. And without this sort of joint effort, where would the world be? Maybe it would still be all right. I don't know. I don't want to guess. But I think it was very, very worrying at that time. And the other point I want to say is that a year later, Mr. Obama said to Mr. Xi Jinping, let's try to fix the climate change issue. And the two of them worked very hard together with their colleagues in Washington and in Beijing. They eventually were able to persuade everybody to sign the climate change deal in Paris. And I give these examples just as a reminder that together we make things happen. Although I know it's being changed later on, but together we make things happen. That's why I believe that the relationship will be important. Eventually people will all realize that.
Just a follow-up question to your first point about China's ambitions, and your view could be characterized then as a defensive view of China's ambitions rather than an offensive one. And the other flip side of that is domestic. Your view is that what China really needs to do is to focus on its domestic priorities and obligations, helping to elevate 1.4 billion people above the middle income trap. If that's the true priority, how is it going to do that?
Well, 2017, China's per capita, GDP per capita is $88, $880 per capita. And the effort for China at this moment is to move this. The government has pledged that Chinese deserve better. They work hard, they deserve better. And what to do? You just have to, to break through the middle income trap. And nothing better than my good friend Steve, who's sitting on the first row. It so happened he dropped by to see me one day. We talked about this. Do you remember you said, yes, Beijing is in the right trap. Do the right thing. So what I was talking about was that it is through the effort of science, technology, and innovation that China is moving ahead. Science and technology and innovation. Science and technology and innovation in what area in this case? Because in the past 10 years, Mr. Jack Ma and Tsai, they worked very hard, and some of his competitors worked very hard, and the science and technology innovation made the economy go forward much faster. So the next stage, this is it. Mm-hmm. And this includes artificial intelligence, 5G, and et cetera, et cetera. And these are intended not to spy on other people. These are intended to help Chinese people to generate more income and become part of a developed nation.
Well, Alibaba is a very innovative company, and we're lucky to have its vice chairman here, Joe Tsai. Joe, China has built world-class infrastructure, as we all know, and Alibaba is now a huge contributor to deriving the benefits from that, capitalizing on that to build a very strong services-oriented company. And you're really emblematic of China's shift towards a consumption-driven economy. Can you walk us through the next 20 years of China's economy and the role of services and consumption in that?
So before I get into the next 20 years, I want to talk about the last 20 years. When I started Alibaba in 1999, the GDP per capita was about $800. And as Mr. Tung said, in 2017, it's 8,800. I think this year, the GDP per capita will exceed $10,000. So in a mere 20 years, the per capita income has gone up more than 10x. That was the past 20 years. But the past 20 years, the economy was driven by export, manufacturing, and also investment. A lot of infrastructure projects. In the next 20 years, you're going to see the economy, the composition of GDP shift to a consumption-driven economy to replace exports. I think in the next 20 years, China will definitely become a net importing country. So that's the first picture. And today, if you look at consumption, the consumption economy in China, out of a $13 trillion economy, it's a $5.5 trillion consumption. So roughly around 40%. But if you look at the more developed markets, United States, Japan, that ratio has gone to 70%. So there's definitely room to grow for the consumption economy. So that's shift number one. There's also a massive shift. Number two is historically China has been the factory of the world. I think it'll continue to be a manufacturing juggernaut, but less so in assembling iPhones or making shoes for the Western markets, but more so focused on more sort of higher technology manufacturing. But the manufacturing sector will, over time, become smaller in favor of the service sector. Last 5 years, China lost 14 million manufacturing jobs, but gained 70 million service jobs. So that's already a huge shift of the economy going from manufacturing to services. What are those service jobs? When people get wealthier, they want to go out to restaurants. They want to go out to movies. They buy stuff on e-commerce, so that need to have logistics, all the delivery people to delivery on the streets. In our ecosystem, we have about 3 million people on the streets every day delivering the packages, the 80 million packages every day that the Alibaba system generates. So those are all service jobs, ordering meals online, delivering food, and things like that. So the shift to a service economy is definitely an inevitable trend that I see. And the third shift is what I would say that's different. China is going to be sort of different from the development in the United States in that most of consumption and the interaction of consumers with brands or whatever is now happening through the internet. That's because the population is very mobile. So the mobile device, people are doing everything on a mobile device. Mobile payments, e-commerce, ordering food, ordering movie tickets, everything is being done on a mobile device. At Alibaba, 90% of our transactions are done on mobile. And it's also a very young consumer base. We have, I mentioned this morning, we have about 75% of our users that are younger than 35 years old. If you're born after 1984, please raise your hand. Okay, just a few. So maybe less than 5% in the audience. But 75% of our users,
digital natives,
less than 30. So what's happening is because of the mobile phone and all the interaction through the mobile device, China is quickly digitizing its economy because when you're engaged with goods and services on the internet, you are capturing data. So this trend of going digital in China is going to go faster than any of the other economies that I see, certainly the more developed, Western developed markets, I think it's going to be going faster than that, in a way, leapfrogging.
So with these sort of staggering projections around rising Chinese consumption, how would you relate this or contrast it maybe even with the leadership statements about the need for the economy to grow in a more sustainable and sort of focusing on quality growth?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the last 20 years growth was sustainable because there's a manufacturing juggernaut, but the quality of that growth is left something to be desired. Manufacturing creates a lot of pollution. Going forward, as I said, the economy is going toward more service jobs, and China is investing. I think part of the misunderstanding of this 2025 plan, Made in China 2025 plan, is China is not going to go backward and have steel factories and create jobs through manufacturing that's going to pollute the world. China is investing in manufacturing technology. Right now, only 13% of industrial production in China is tech, has a tech element in it. But over time, there's going to be more clean manufacturing, investing in clean energy, and also investing in sustainable farming, things like that. Going forward, that's going to be the next growth drivers for China.
We haven't heard a lot about clean manufacturing. But this seems like an area that's ripe for disruption. And I think perhaps your automation that you've done in some of your factories is maybe a sign of that, as well as industrial robotics and so forth. That's sort of what you're referring to more broadly, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we're, because of AI, because of the way to train the machine to do things that humans can do. For example, we run our warehouse operations with machines. So that's part of that. You have a logistics business that doesn't hire a lot of people.
Excellent. Steve Schwarzman from the Blackstone Group, let me turn to you. Now, I see how few millennials there are in the room, so I hesitate to ask this question, but who's familiar with the website Quora? I hope lots of people are familiar with Quora. Okay, good. So I can use that as a point of reference. So I, like many of you, I get a weekly sort of digest from Quora of questions and answers recommended to me that might be interesting, and one popped up the other day that's right up our alley. And the question was, why is China's economy nosediving? And guess what the most upvoted answer was to that question? The most upvoted answer was, because your math sucks. And so pardon my language, but I think it's illustrative of how polarizing debates are about China. Because you have these, a lot of people who pose this question, this assumption that the economy is nosediving, but then you have a lot of voices saying that's not true at all. Even with decelerating Chinese growth, it's still the largest net contributor to global growth. And I imagine, Steve, you have some sympathy with that respondent, because you're obviously quite bullish on China. And at the same time, though, as you well know, this is a critical period in reforms for China and trying to manage the ballooning debt, particularly since the financial crisis, and also some of the newer circumstances with China shifting into a current account deficit this year and so forth. So give us, please, your assessment of the reform process that's underway right now.
Well, first, before I start, I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be on a stage with CH and Joe. I've known CH for decades, and he never gets older. He's just moving a little slower, but he doesn't get older. So it's good to be on. And Joe and his partners, Jack Ma, have created a company out of literally nothing. That's one of the most extraordinary businesses in the world. It's really more than a business. It's transforming a country, and the consumption patterns and delivery techniques, and it's really hard to believe that people walking around did that. So congratulations. In terms of China, well, I don't know that I'm a bull. I'm just objective, and China's pretty remarkable place. It's not collapsing. That's almost as silly as believing that the U.S. was collapsing in the fourth quarter, but there was no difficulty getting a consensus by having CNBC talk to Bloomberg. And if they had just talked to some of us who actually operated in the real world, you would have seen there was not going to be a recession. In the modern world, that doesn't stop people from declaring things. And so what people don't understand about China, because people look at their own world and then, project on another country. China's a pretty unusual place, and they've grown so fast for so long that there's no precedent for that in modern history, maybe not ever. And so they're constantly used to things going wrong. When things go wrong in a Western country, that's like a bad thing. In China, when something goes wrong, it's not a great thing, but it's just an expected thing. And they have a longer-term perspective, and they know where they're going, more or less, certainly compared to us. And when they run into a problem where they fall short, they just change where they're going. And then they get back on track, and maybe one person loses their job, but it's not the whole thing. And that was sort of what was going on. After the tariffs hit, and regular people in China got scared, which is normal, because they'd never seen that before in terms of a U.S.-Chinese relationship. And so, the economy started going down. It's classic Chinese. What valve do we have to play with to get us on track? And whether that's cutting tax rates or forced lending through their banking system and the rest of it. I was there, I guess it was 4 weeks ago, at China Development Forum. I was over at the central bank, and they said, yeah, that's all work. Don't worry about it. And, growth's up. And I talked to individual business people to see whether the economy was continuing to collapse. And they said, no, it was a little soft there, but, that's flat and it's actually coming back. So China has much greater ability to adapt. The other thing, for people in this audience, some of whom are Chinese, I can see some like, Steve Roach and Larry Lau, know a lot about China. China is changing so quickly, and CH was alluding to it, and Joe's lived with it, that I say that, 1 year in China is like a dog year. It's like 7 years for a normal person, and it never stops. So the people living there are trying to cope with future shock, but future shock is now. And you have to absorb it and rethink what you're doing and readapt it. In the West, we're sort of like in slow motion, compared to China. And the changes, can you imagine in 20 years going from, whatever it was, $800 to GDP per capita up to $10,000? I mean, it's like a revolution that's happened in the course of a high school kid's life, right? Between then and graduating from high school or second year in college. And they keep doing all these different things and just layer them on to their society and coping with it. And so, they're always trying to plan ahead to keep ahead of this change. And now, they realize that, as their economy's adjusting, changing, like Joe's saying, that having all of the framework of a sort of 19th century mercantile economy with large tariff walls and restrictions on investment and lack of intellectual property and all these types of things worked great. And who would ever want to give them up? They seem to work great. On the other hand, their economy's changing, The rest of the world is reacting adversely. And so, like normal Chinese approach, they sort of sit around and say, I guess that doesn't work anymore. We're going to have to adjust. And so what you're seeing with the trade negotiations, which I think most people would have said, how would this ever happen with these tariffs? Because this is like really new stuff for the United States, at least in the last 100 years. With the use of tariffs in an aggressive way, that everybody's at a table, and both countries believe there's something in it for both of them to try and make a deal. I can't predict whether this trip to China or Liu He's next trip to the U.S. or whether it'll need another round, to get it done, because this is complicated stuff. Usually trade deals take years. But I'm positive that they will come up with something that works. But it will not be, sort of a trade deal that solves all problems for all people and moves China into, sort of the modern world. That's actually too shocking for them to imagine, because look at what they're doing now and where they came from. So there's a process of normalization that'll take some period of time, and it's sort of like a journey. It's got to start someplace. I think it'll start. What'll happen is that some people will criticize that for not going far enough. Within China, there'll probably be a group saying, I wish we hadn't gone that far, and that's the nature of change. But the course that I think the countries are on is logical. I see China from the energy. If you haven't been there, and most people in this, how many people in this room have been to China? Well, that looks like at least half.
Yep.
The other half, you got to do it. I mean, you got to do it. I started a program there called the Schwarzman Scholars, and where we take people from around the world to go to China for a year, meet the leaders of the country, get a master's degree, get a mentor from society, prominent Chinese persons, so they really know what they're doing. But I have a little slogan that says China is not an elective course. It's core curriculum. And historically, China, except for this bad period of the last century or two, basically comprised 20 to 25% of global GDP. They're around 15 now. So guess what? They're going. And they'll get to their 20 to 25, which is a historical type of level. Stuff happens when you do that. And relationships change among nations. I think that's a logical thing. The question is doing this in a responsible way that doesn't trigger anger or friction that can be misinterpreted. And that's not saying that everyone's motives are pure in any country. It's not being an apologist. It's just the nature that countries do well when they have good relationships with other countries. They learn to adjust. For China, I'm an American, so I'm American-centric. So I apologize for the Chinese in the audience, but the Chinese will adjust to that because they're clever. They have, as C.H. says, had a long history with war. One of the interesting things, I was talking to President Xi about Korea and wars, and he said, well, we keep records for thousands of years of every battle fought by the emperor. And I said, you've got to be kidding. He said, no, every battle. And he said, we know that war is a bad thing. And we also know that fighting the Koreans is a bad thing too, which happened every 200 years. And he said what happens is it's always a very bad outcome. No matter who, quote, wins, it's to be avoided. And so the Chinese have a long memory and a long history. Unlike Americans, we sort of move on from thing to thing. We don't have much of a long-term memory. We're a very new country. So I think there's a real prospect for adjustment, but don't expect this to be some kind of a smooth ride, because you can't when you're driving so fast, right? If China were a car, it'd be driving around 220 miles an hour, right? And stuff happens at high speed.
But on good roads.
And well, on U.S. roads you couldn't do it. On Chinese roads you actually could do it.
Joe, let me bring you in on the trade war that Steve brought up as well, because here, despite the dialogue and Steve's view that we can have adjustments and so forth, right now, for all of the conversation around the topic, we still have fairly irreconcilable perspectives. You hear a lot of people, Larry Kudlow, saying, we've got a lot of leverage still, the economy is slowing down. We now have Steve Mnuchin and Bob Lighthizer, I think, flying over there right now for negotiations. But so there again, contrasting views. You have this perspective that China has a lot of ground it still needs to give, and then from the other side, you kind of have a sense that what China is doing is the bare minimum, in order to preserve the kind of market access that it has, not allow tariffs to be raised any further, but it's still going to pursue its policies around sort of, in a way, permanently substituting or guarding against excessive dependence on imports from the U.S. So, what are the signals you're looking for in the next 6 months to a year in the trade war?
Well, I think we saw Secretary Mnuchin, and he seemed fairly constructive as he was on the way to China. So the trade deal, we can't predict it, but I think at some point the whole sort of trade deficit, how much China will buy soybeans and things like that, probably will get resolved over time. But I think there are larger issues at stake. Namely the issue of the whole Chinese economy, the state subsidies and control by the state on quite a bit of the economy, for example, the banking sector. And the other issue being whether China is going to open up markets. But I think some of these issues, I believe, will correct itself just because of the massive shifts that I talked about before. If China becomes a consumption-driven economy, it'll be a net importer of goods over time. And in fact, President Xi has talked about over the next 15 years, China will import $30 trillion of goods, and in addition, $10 trillion of services. When I read that, I focused on the 10 trillion because that's very interesting to me. That means sectors like healthcare, financial services will get opened up, and there is a commitment from the top down to do that. But what I hope to see a little bit more is that certain parts of the economy can be pushed towards a more market-driven, market-based economy. I don't worry about that in our industry. The internet business is very market-driven and very, very competitive, and it's all private enterprises competing. But some of the other sectors probably will take a little bit of time to reform. So don't know if those issues are kind of immediate issues or immediate demands by the American side that need to be fixed. These things take time to fix. So I think there will be some mention of those types of issues, structural issues, in the trade deal. But
you're bringing up some very positive opportunities, right? That don't often get associated with the bilateral relationship because of the trade war. And one of them is indeed one of the priorities for this year, capital account liberalization, which is certainly a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity. One senses that this time around the government is very, very serious about it and drawing in that capital into debt, equity markets, and so forth. So I'd love for you guys to comment on that as well, because again, the focus has been perhaps too much on the trade dynamic and less so on financial markets.
Well, I'll just talk briefly about that, because that was actually a question I asked during a lunch session where Mr. Tung was in, and I think Mr. Tung will probably have something to comment on as well. If China becomes a net importer, it'll need to buy from all over the world. So what currency are they going to buy? What are they going to ask the sellers to accept? Is it going to be US dollars or Japanese yen or euros if they buy from America or Europe? Or is it going to be RMB? If they buy if they still use US dollars, they will have to sell the RMB, which puts downward pressure on the RMB. But if there's a convincing narrative about the convertibility of RMB, then people would be receptive to receive the RMB in trade terms. What are they going to do with the RMB? They're going to reinvest back into financial assets in China, which calls for opening up of the bond markets. The government debt market should go deeper. These are all things. I think the trade terms and also the financial terms are interlinked, because once the world is flush with RMB, they will have to be reinvested back into China, into financial assets. And so as a policymaker, you have to really think about how to open up the financial markets for foreign investment.
Mr. Tung?
Yeah, I want to say a few things on this point. That firstly is that Chinese and American trade is really becoming more and more complementary. I remember with Larry Lau, we did a paper from Hong Kong, which talks about this is going to happen. Nobody quite believe us. But today, America is the largest producer of oil and gas in the world. Guess who is the largest buyer? It's China. America is the largest producer of farm products. Who are the buyers? The largest buyers. It's China today. America is the largest producer of consumer goods of all kinds. Who are the buyers? China today. So it's all happening. It's all happening very naturally. And the people in the business, they feel it. And that's why I'm also optimistic with my colleagues on the stage that I think that there is going to be hopefully a resolution. I'm just guessing, okay. But I hope, because things are happening. In other words, we are not taking a picture 10 months ago, 2 years ago, and say what's happening. It's changing all the time. And I was saying this afternoon, thinking about it, talking to some of my European friends, who today are is the best quality high-speed train. It's from China. It's no longer from Germany or France. It's not from Japan. It's from China. Who are the biggest shipbuilder in the world? It's no longer in Europe. It's no longer in Japan. It's not even Korea. It's now China again. And who are the biggest builder of power plants, ports, and so on? Everything is China. So China has not only the capacity and the know-how to do it, and to the extent they can sell to other people who want it, it will happen also. What I'm saying is that the world is changing. The world is changing. But what China wants to do is to take advantage of this opportunity, make a better world for Chinese people, but also importantly, make a better world for all of us. And may I add, do it together with the United States of America. because helping the world to do better, it's important the two countries work together.
Steve, Joe has said that you'd like to see more of the Chinese economy in private control, and with capital account liberalization, as you know, there's significant regulatory reforms that have to be undertaken. So do you have confidence that, that transition is going to happen in the time frame that investors, certainly asset managers, pension funds, a lot of the institutions that are represented in this room at this event, you advocate that opportunity to them? Do they need to be buying into, the Chinese markets?
I think this happens gradually. It's been happening somewhat. I think you'll see in the new trade agreement areas that are opening that, financial institutions which foreigners only owned a minority of will be able to not only own a majority, but could within a relatively short period of time, own 100% of. And that's a start in one sector that's pretty easily figure-outable, if that's a word, just because it's finance. It's numbers, you can figure it out. So I think you will be seeing that. Part of this is a system where, what's the law? China has laws, but mostly, local people don't necessarily look at them like they're U.S. laws. U.S., you have a law, you comply, or something bad happens to you. In China, you have a law, it's sort of like something you don't want to be caught violating, but in the meanwhile, it's not something that you have to adhere to in the same way. So to really have capital of a certain type, I think that system will have to evolve, and that'll really take some time. But in areas that are easily controlled, like finance, that'll happen pretty quickly. One other thing that I think is worth mentioning, because you started, Parag, with the Cold War type of thing, and we're talking about economics, and I think on economics matters, that's sort of somewhat in a box now in terms of working forward. But you are seeing, the response on the U.S. side that you mentioned, and that's in response to things that have happened on the Chinese side, whether it's islands that were supposed to be peaceful that become militarized, or the building of a much bigger navy, or shipping things to people that are sort of prohibited. There are a variety of things that are going on that, when looked at from a U.S. perspective, along with the tech part of the world, with this China 2025, which called for, I read the whole document, called for Chinese dominance of I don't know whether it was 9 technologies or 7 technologies, from AI to quantum to the rest of it. To a Westerner observing all that, it triggers responses that say somebody's getting really aggressive here, and it's bringing forth the kind of sort of conclusion that you opened with. And I think this is an issue that China is going to have to deal with. U.S. also as the dominant world military power, but China's going to have to figure out what signals it wants to put out to the world. If those are the signals, and that increases, then logic would say this will be a pretty contested type of relationship of friction. There's no reason that I know of why China would continue doing that, other than they were doing it, and now they've sort of gotten the message that that's not well received. They'll either adjust or they'll continue. And if they continue, there'll be more and more friction. And why would you want to do that rationally?
Right.
Why would you want to do that? So one example of adjustment, not to make a full proof, but on the Belt and Road, there were deals that were being done that probably wouldn't have met a normal economic standard that are now having difficulty. And they've announced that they want to use third parties now as validators to make sure they're doing the right deals. This is a very Chinese type of approach. They sort of run into something, they've got an objective, it doesn't work, they back off, they try and fix it, and hopefully these things will get addressed. And that's the basis of I think, your conclusion.
Yeah. Well, this weekend, when China had hosted the second Belt and Road Summit, we clearly saw this accommodation on display, and that appreciating that China has that ability to adapt and make compromises with its partners to, forgive or reduce debts or the outstanding volume of investment in loans for certain projects is not a narrative about Belt and Road that's appreciated here. And recently in the White House, I heard people say, we almost blasé. We expect Belt and Road to collapse under the weight of these failed projects. And so clearly there's not an appreciation that this is a major global initiative. You had a very strong turnout in Beijing this past weekend. And in fact, one could go so far as to say that if China does bring in third parties and make it more transparent, and if it is further multilateralized, it's actually going to help Asia in some ways to decouple almost, because you have such strong trade linkages across the Asian space. So I think we should talk about Belt and Road a little bit. And Joe, I'd like to come back to you on this, and then to Mr. Tung, because the digital Silk Road is a very important component of this. And Alibaba has already had a very strong role in setting up innovation centers in countries that are participating actively, from all across the region, really, from Russia to Israel, India, and so forth. They're all locations now where Alibaba is very active in helping to develop this digital Silk Road. So can you give us a view on Belt and Road that's less sort of burdened by, the kind of fear-mongering rhetoric that we often hear about, and much more about the pragmatic dimensions of how it's actually helping to enhance connectivity and trade and digitization in a wide range of historically underdeveloped economies?
Well, you're looking at all of these Belt and Road countries, from Southeast Asia to Central Asia, all the way to Europe, and a lot of these are by and large, still developing economies. And so from Alibaba's perspective, we, having the China experience over the last 20 years, we know how to do developing economies. We know how to reach consumers in the developing economies. So our first step in terms of internationalizing our business is to go to Southeast Asia. 600 million population in 6 countries. We're operating in those countries, an e-commerce business, including logistics. And don't forget, even though e-commerce on the surface looks like everything is digital and you do everything on a phone, there's still delivery, logistics that need to be done, and that's very, very physical. So you have to think about where to establish logistics points, and where to set up these warehouses. We've established our first logistics, sort of regional logistics hub in Malaysia. And as part of that project, besides building warehouses, we are also implementing training programs so that Malaysian merchants can come onto the Alibaba platform and tap into the Chinese market. The whole focus of that project is what we call EWTP, Electronic World Trading Platform. It is focused on helping small businesses to trade around the world. Today we're 1 foot in China, either going outbound or coming inbound. But in the future, there could be SMEs trading on our EWTP platforms between third countries. that have nothing to do with China. And that's the big vision. We want to build both a digital network, but also the physical infrastructure in terms of logistics and payment and training and supporting small businesses, credit, for example, to support that effort.
Steve, let me just quickly come to you on the back of that point, actually, because it seems like this is a tremendous economic growth opportunity. We'd want to see American businesses selling into the growth story in the emerging and frontier markets. But much like the U.S. backed away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, it has a confrontational view about Belt and Road. Is this another, going to be another missed opportunity for the American export sector and businesses?
Well, it's tough to do what Alibaba is doing.
Right.
On the ground. In a place that's pretty close, not close, but pretty close geographically, with similar sort of characteristics of a frontier economy. Americans tend not to be as good at that, actually. So whether they're going to miss it all, I don't think they'll grab it. Not because of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which, by the way, was dead under the previous administration.
Correct.
It's the current one seems to be able to attract a lot of bad news, and so it's dead under theirs too. I mean, that wouldn't have been what I would have done, but doesn't matter. I'm just, like a civilian. But I don't think America will realize as well as certain Chinese companies will in Southeast Asia.
Mr. Tung, there is obviously a geopolitical dimension to Belt and Road. On the one hand, it's promoting connectivity, trade, more frictionlessness. On the other hand, it's clearly highlighting geopolitical tensions between countries because it's viewed for example, in the case of India, as an initiative that could surround, in many ways, India through strategic infrastructures controlled by China. And India is a good example of this because on the one hand, India is not formally joined the Belt and Road Initiative, but on the other hand, it is the second largest shareholder of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the largest recipient of loans from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So can you untangle that for us, especially because great power relations in Asia are a critical part of overall story and stability?
Well, so far India is concerned, I think, I want to just deviate and then come back a bit. I always remember what George Shultz said to me and Henry Kissinger said to me. Both of them said, the president I served told me, don't you dare touch that button. Nobody touch that button. It's unworkable. So in other words, nuclear option. Is there a real nuclear option? We must always remember that. There are wise people talking like this, but we're not doing very much about it. I think, Chinese leaders, I'm sure it's the same way. How it's unconscionable to press that button, and yet we China is having nuclear weapon. Why? Not because they want to be the first use. They have said to the world, we're not going to use that weapon. But if somebody hit us first, then we will retaliate. That's what China has been saying all along. My point is this, working with China, the question is that their military build-up, what purpose? It's for defensive purpose. It's not for offensive purpose. Not for offensive purpose. So that's my number one point. Number 2 point, same thing with India. China and India, how can they fight each other? They shouldn't fight each other. Why? Because one has 1.4 billion people, the other have close to 1.4 billion people. Can you imagine they fight together? Can you imagine both of them are nuclear weapon people? Of course it's not going to happen. We all may try to make sure it wouldn't happen. And so my point is this, a China and US working together to solve the world problem, we solve a lot of world problems. If China and US is confrontational, when there's no reason to be confrontational, you make sure that all the other problems will be very difficult to solve. So all I'm trying to say is that, hey, United States of America, listen carefully some of these voices that's happening, not only in Asia, but also in America also. The other thing I want to add is about South China Sea. You know, it's 500 years ago, it belonged to China in the Ming Dynasty and all this sort of thing. So put it aside. But in 1943, Roosevelt called a meeting at Cairo and said to everybody that the territory taken by the Japanese at that time must be all returned to China. And he lines it out. It's Manchuria, it's Taiwan, it's Spratleys, and what have you in South China Sea. It's all detailed down. And United States of American president said this, and they signed the Cairo Agreement. And later on, still better, after 43, in 1951, in San Francisco, there was a peace treaty signed. The two China, Taiwan and the People's Republic of China were not invited, but never mind. The peace treaty was signed to give fair credit to the United States. They made sure that Japan will commit to quickly return these islands to China, which they did, you know. So from every aspect, we have to say, as a Chinese, that, hey, these islands belong to China. What is the problem, you know? And the problem really is this, that Americans are present there. China's 80% of seaborne trade comes from South China Sea, and they have to protect themselves. And that's the problem, you know. And I have friends in America tell me, CH, when the Japanese were fighting with the Americans, all their cargo, seaborne cargo, goes through South China Sea to Japan. Everyone was sunk by America. So that's the reason why. For China, it's just a defensive thing. You know, hey, we have to be careful. We have to be careful. So what I want to say to my American friends is that U.S.-China relations is too important. We got to figure out how we can solve this thing. It's too important for us.
Well, I think we should all be heartened by how all three of our panelists have emphasized joint problem solving. You know, it's not just the economic cooperation that is within grasp, if some of the points of tension can be ironed out, but also some of the areas that we didn't get to talk enough about, such as technology. Steve, you've made a very generous gift to MIT, for example, around AI, and Joe, as well as you know, with China being such a leader in AI, there's another area where there could be a lot more bilateral cooperation as it relates to global problem solving. So I hope that this is a first step, maybe, in identifying some of those areas where we can turn confrontation into cooperation. So even as we face an uncertain future, as the title of the panel suggested, hopefully we can be cautiously optimistic about it. So with that, we need to wrap up now, but please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists for their comments. Thank you.